Hey everyone, and welcome to our 8th Sunday video reflection. My hair is shorter, my beard is longer, and there's a lot more daylight than there was when we started doing these almost 2 months ago. But we're still here for you every Sunday, and we will be until we have the joy of meeting in person again. My name is Maicon, and I'm the pastor at Oslo International Church, and today I want to talk about suffering. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. These words, now very well known, were written by Donne, who was then Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1623, and he wrote them as he lay in what he was convinced was his deathbed. Though it was found out later to not have been the case, for all that he knew, at the time, he had been infected by the plague that once more was sweeping through London, killing thousands. And that was as clear a death sentence as any. And as he prayed for a miracle, he also processed his suffering by praying and by writing what eventually became his devotions upon emergent occasions. The words I just shared with you are from the Meditation 17 in the devotions, and the context is roughly this. As John Donne laid in bed one day, he heard the church bells toll, and he knew that they were announcing another funeral. And in his suffering, he wondered if that funeral might be his own. Were those bells marking the coming of his own death? Of course, soon he realized that they were marking the death of another, but also his in some way. And in that context, he wrote Meditation 17. The bells don't toll often these days, and they have long stopped being a marker of news for most of us. But the screens of our computers and our phones, they lighten up every day, every hour, every minute, announcing new deaths, new measures, new predictions, new gloomy declarations about our uncertain future. In the middle of the corona crisis that we are living in, we can't help but ask, who does the bell toll for this time? And very often the foremost question in our minds is it coming close? Will these new measures affect me? Is my work, my livelihood at risk? Is my life at risk? How many pieces of my plan for tomorrow, for the year, for the life, how many pieces will be pulled out by this new development of the crisis? And then almost unavoidably, the second set of questions rushes in. How can I protect my family? How can I protect my financial security? How can I avoid the worst? And then, of course, why is this happening? Why now? Why me? And whose fault is it? All of this, in a very real sense of the word, are a natural response. Avoiding suffering is a strategy for survival. It is an instinctive reaction to threats so that we can try and identify and avoid them so that we can survive. But man, do we go beyond that evolutionary instinctive reaction? We go all the way in our theories and measures and conclusions and conspiracies. We want to avoid suffering. And if we do end up suffering, we want the quickest way out. And if we do have to suffer, we would like to at least be given a reason why, and preferably something or someone to blame. This video starts a new series in OiC, which we have called Enduring presence, enduring presence. As we continue to explore God's presence in the world, in space and time, we want to turn our gaze now towards the reality of suffering. So the question for this series is the question of God's presence in the reality of suffering. So back to our question of the crisis, now we're bringing the divine into the picture. And I guess it's again only natural that we would want God to do at least two things. To give us a way out of suffering and to give us an explanation for suffering. Preferably, we would like to know who we can blame. If God is present in this world, so undeniably marked by suffering, we would like Him to give us some answers. But when God does walk with us as a humanity most clearly and most visibly in the person of Jesus Christ, He seems to not be interested in answering our why question. And He also doesn't seem interested at all in the blame game. Luke tells us of an occasion in which some people bring this matter before Jesus. And as Jesus often does so masterfully, He flips the whole thing on its head. The story is in Luke 13, and I want to read it for you now. And it says, "Now there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Jesus answered, 'Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will perish.' Or those 18 who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish." Then He told this parable. "A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, 'For 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?' 'Sir,' the man replied, 'leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down.'" Jesus is commenting on two different tragic events here, which we don't have many details about, but apparently were well known to the people Jesus is interacting with. And there's a couple of things we need to know in order to understand Jesus' answer. The first is that there was a theological understanding that was current at the time that assumed that suffering was always a direct consequence of sin. It could have been that the person that was suffering had sinned themselves, or that their parents had sinned, or that the king of the nation or the nation itself had sinned, but there was always someone or something that they could blame. This, by the way, is not the only instance where the gospel writers show Jesus dealing with this particular understanding. Another good example is when He heals a man that was born blind, and people ask Jesus very directly if this man was blind because of his own sin or because of the sin of his parents, to which Jesus answers, neither. Which is very much the same thing implied on His answer here. Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners and that's why this happened to them? I tell you, no. And here Jesus, after this, could perhaps have taken a different stroll on the same blame lane and still say something that would make His crowd happy and satisfied. And here comes the other thing that we need to understand. Pilate, who apparently had those Galileans killed, was a Roman authority, a representative of the empire, the power dominating Israel at the time. So here was a great opportunity for Him to say, this was the Romans. This was the Romans' fault. They are to blame, those pagan Romans. It's their fault. But Jesus doesn't do that. In fact, He doesn't seem interested in doing that. He goes in a completely different direction, a completely unexpected direction. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. What? And then he goes on to mention this accident involving some people and that had a tower fall over them, which you couldn't blame on other people. So it's must obviously in the mindset of the time that they deserved it. That is some sort of divine punishment. But he again says, no, but unless you repent, you too will all perish. What is this? Is Jesus threatening these people? How does this even make sense that he is telling them that it is not because those people were particularly bad sinners in comparison to the rest that has happened to them, but then he says that if his listeners don't repent, they will die? Are we all to expect towers to start falling on our heads? And as if we weren't confused enough, Jesus goes on to tell this parable of the unfruitful tree. Why is he doing that? Because he is shifting focus. He is changing the terms of the conversation. With the stories of the tragedies involving people, the presumption was that they have done something to deserve their suffering. But the parable presents us with a tree that to begin with can't really do something bad, can't sin to deserve suffering. So why is the tree going to be cut down? Well, not because it did something bad, but because it's not producing something good that it should be producing. It's not giving fruit. So is Jesus saying that not only if we do something bad, but also if we don't do good, we can expect suffering and towers falling on our heads? Is that what Jesus is saying? No, because the focus of the parable is not that the tree is going to be cut down in a year. We don't know that. We know that's a possibility. We don't know that it happens. What we do know is that it will be nurtured and given time to produce fruit. I guess part of our struggle understanding all of this is that we've made repent into a concept, and a concept that involves mainly internal mental and spiritual work. But the original meaning, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek iterations of the word, has more to do with changing attitude, changing directions, having a change of mind. Rather than making this about who deserves death and suffering and who doesn't, Jesus moves the conversation away from that mentality towards a focus on what we do with life. He does not answer why we suffer, but he does ask us how we react when we suffer or contemplate suffering. Where does that lead us? Does it lead us towards fear and selfishness? This sense of wanting to protect myself at all costs? Or does it lead us towards fruitfulness and compassion? And I'm not talking here about denying suffering, and I'm not talking about refusing help when we're suffering. The gardener digs around and fertilizes the tree because the tree needs nurturing. It doesn't abandon the tree to its own luck. The question is, what do we do with that? What do we do with that reality of suffering and of being cared for in suffering, if that's the case? Do we keep it to ourselves, or do we grow it into fruits to nurture and feed others? Jesus doesn't answer the question of why we suffer. And for all we know, we can't choose if we will suffer or not in this world. But is our main concern avoiding death or bearing fruit while we live? Is our main focus death or life? Or are we more concerned that we may be felled or that we may not bear fruit to a hungry world? And in that sense, suffering may be a place that calls us to repent, to have a change of mind. Suffering may be a place that teaches us to be more concerned with the questions of compassion than with the questions of blame and fear. Perhaps that means even that, against the grain of our culture and of our very instincts, that we may need to sometimes walk not away from suffering, but into it. It is, after all, the hungry that most need the fruit that I may bear. The Beatitudes that Jesus tells us about in the Sermon on the Mount are not a road away from suffering, but they are the marks of the presence of Christ and His kingdom in the middle of the reality of suffering. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the merciful. It's not that Christ desired suffering. It was not His desire to embrace suffering. It was His desire to bear fruit. It was His desire to embrace us. And that means walking with us in our reality that invariably involves suffering. And that still means walking with us today in our reality that invariably involves suffering. And it means us walking with each other in a reality that invariably involves suffering. Quite independently of why there is suffering or whom we might like to blame for it, Christ is inviting us to look at the reality of suffering with compassion and with willingness. Willingness to change our ways and willingness to be nurtured and cared for to bear fruit. A willingness to move from being concerned if the bell tolls for us because we are afraid, but to move towards knowing that it does toll for us because it calls us to compassion and love. That is the challenge also today. As it was for John Donne in the time of the plague, it is for us today in the time of the coronavirus crisis, and it will be tomorrow when this virus is gone. But suffering is still around us, and Jesus is still with us. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn His face towards each and every one of you, into your homes, into your lives, and give you peace. Go in peace and bear fruit joyfully.